Welcome, everybody. This presentation will help you combine your e-learning projects with realistic project management. Now, I know that seems like a weird combination, but the two go together pretty well. So let's get started. Project management is needed for both small and large projects. In this overview session, I'll be sharing with you some of the basics of project management. I'd like to break it down into 4 phases: define, plan, manage, and review. It's important to remember that the point of project management is to communicate effectively and add new value to your organization. In this presentation, you are going to learn what project management is, how to define what's going into the project, how to build plans for projects, manage those projects, and then complete the projects by ending well. Notice the phrase at the bottom. We like to say, dare to properly manage resources. See that define, plan, manage, and review have the same first letters of each word as dare to properly manage resources. Now, I'm sure you are wondering about this picture. I'd like to challenge you to think about this question. What's actually wrong with this picture? What bothers you? You're probably thinking, well, there's a pole in the middle of the road. It seems like there's been some road work, but most confusing, a car seems to be leaving the road work area. Clearly, there is a lack of communication and maybe even attention. I'm going to guess that you have times in your work that you feel you are juggling something just like this scene. It seems daunting and impossible. The last slide we looked at was about chaos, but this one looks a lot more fun. In this fun picture, the people seem to be working together and really enjoying themselves. I like to call projects flash mobs because with flash mobs, people come together with some bit of instruction to do something fun and interesting. What's similar between the way you work and the way a flash mob is done? Make a note about a problem with the first picture we saw in the pole in the road, and think about the success of this picture. We all want to be in the productive picture, right? Notice the phrase, bad news early is good news. In projects, it's critical to be honest. It's critical that everyone is sharing the truth of bad or even good results as quickly as possible. That's why we use this phrase, bad news early is good news. When I'm working on a new project, I want to be told what I need to do before it's too late. Let's review some of the things we've been thinking about. Please stop the recording and take a minute to read the text in the green box. Here are some takeaways. Project management is a process that can be used over and over to define, plan, manage, and review business needs, aka projects. It's actually a template or a cheat sheet consisting of knowledge, skills, tools, and techniques. Projects, whether large or small, need people and process together to create a great finished project. This is true for both e-learning projects or any other kind of project. We'll talk more about this later. We clearly know now that virtual communication is good, quick, concise communication, but when there are lots of people, thoughts, and conflicts, this virtual communication can break. I'm sure many of you have experienced this. To make sure that everyone knows where their sweet spot is requires consistent process. First, you want to establish team objectives. Clearly define and describe team objectives in a written document that's available online to everyone on your team. Each team member will be able to know and understand what is required for each person, creating synergy and productive teams. Next, you want to establish some ground rules. That's what we use project objectives for. Project objectives determine the ground rules. Next, you want to build a communication plan. Find channels that work. Like for us, we use Slack. Talk informally and formally as needed with everyone on your team. Have shorter and clear task assignments. Be precise and clear on what you're working on. Does anyone else need some help? And schedule the tasks and share the schedule. Another good one is be empathetic. Monitor the cadence of the people and make sure everybody's okay. Now pause the recording and think about these 6 processes to ensure that your projects and your communications are staying aligned when people are not necessarily face-to-face. First thing I'd like you to do is I'd like you to pause the recording and write down 10 things that are waiting for you that you haven't started yet. 10 things that are on your to-do list. Next, what we're going to do is identify which of the to-do items that you chose are projects and which ones are processes. Here's a little clue. A project has a beginning and an end. Think of it as start and stop. A process can go forever. In other words, it's reused. Think about that a little bit because you'll probably want to argue about that later. Welcome back. Here are a few of the examples of my to-do items. First one was meet with the head of sales to discuss allocation of staff. Follow the project management process and show others how to do it. Identify who the stakeholders will be. And finally, review risks of other similar projects. These are all examples of to-do items. So let's try to figure out when we're looking at projects and processes, what is it? Is it a project or a process? These words are really important for that. First, the word task, which is sometimes called activity. A task is a unit of work that has a beginning and an end. A project is a collection of tasks, and it also has a beginning and an end. A process, though, is a collection of tasks that repeat over and over. They'll never end with a dedicated staff. Think about what might happen to your work if you mixed up process and project, and sometimes people do. It would be really tough to finish any project work and get things done if you were treating it as a process that's going forever. It's very normal for people to mix these terms up, causing some confusions in projects. How can you be sure that you are building a project that has a beginning and an end, or even a process that could go on forever? Here are 4 criteria that are processes, not projects. If you can't finish anything in less than 4 hours uninterrupted, you're probably actually working on a process, not a project. If you need a bunch of people's help to finish the work, you're likely working with process. If it has been on your to-do list forever and you have never looked at it, it's probably a process. And if you're really not sure what you're going to get at the end of this project, it's actually a process. Let's talk about the not-so-secret society. Up until now, I've been showing you the basics of project management. For some people, the projects they have are not very big, and simple project management works just fine. For more complex projects, the Project Management Institute, which is www.pmi.org, is the place to go. The acronym PMBOK, which stands for Project Management Body of Knowledge, is a de facto guide to building complex projects. PMI also certifies different levels of project management workshops, for example, PMP, Project Management Professional, and CAPM, Certified Associate in Project Management. The Certified Associate in Project Management is PMI's entry-level certification, ideal for people interested in a career in project management who have little relevant experience. PMI also requires that people continue to log professional development units, PDUs, to make sure they keep their certification up to date. Currently, PMI also has workshops on Agile. Pause and read through the 10 knowledge areas of PMI above. Think about which areas you are proficient in and others that you might want to learn about based on your career goals. Each of these knowledge areas have certification opportunities within PMI, Project Management Institute. Notice also that there are 3 newer knowledge areas: program management, portfolio management, and agile certification. There are other organizations that have knowledge areas and disciplines for project management as well, although PMI has a pretty strong brand. Let's talk a little bit more about the project manager. There's often some confusion about this role, specifically the difference between the project manager and the project team members. You may be surprised to find out that the project manager does not own the project. The business owns the project. The project manager is accountable for project deliverables, the people on the project, and the timelines. The project manager's big job is to plan, organize, and manage the project until it is completely done. Sometimes project managers forget that they are a steward to the other roles. They should be working with them, but not necessarily bossing them around. The project manager leads the project team members and gets marching orders from another term, the project sponsor. We'll talk about that later. Pause the recording and think about how projects work at your organization. Do you know who your project manager, your project team members, and your project sponsor is? What do you need to shore up with this arrangement? As the project manager, you have 3 important responsibilities. In a way, you're looking back to learn from past experiences. You're in the now with the teams and activities that you're working with, and you're looking to the future to see where the project and team are going. Sometimes a person plays the role of both a project manager and a team member. Here, I recommend that if you have to do that, which is not really a great idea, hold time on your calendar for watching your project and doing the project. Usually one or the other takes over, and if you don't schedule, the 2 roles will get messed up. So to review, the project sponsor is the boss of the whole project. That doesn't necessarily mean that that person knows what to do as the boss of the project. Here are 3 important things a project sponsor must do for the project to be successful. They must work with the funding and business unit, especially high-level people who have lots of influence. They provide or approve funding for resources as the project is built. And they practice governance, or they approve governance. It is the project sponsor's job to make critical decisions that impact time, quality, and money. The project manager may be the person that alerts the project sponsor to the need for a money decision. Okay, it's quiz time. Pause the recording and see if you understand the 2 different roles of project sponsor and project manager. Provide status reports to stakeholders. That's the project manager. Assigns tasks to people. That's the project manager. Determines the business objectives, or in other words, the goals. Technically, that's the project sponsor, but they'd be talking to the project manager as well. Determines the project objectives. What will we have that we don't have now? That's the project manager again. Who recommends what to do when money, time, or quality are threatened? Again, project manager. Who decides what to do when money, time, or quality is threatened? The project sponsor. So we used to call the project sponsor the decider. Now you know the 3 main roles working on the project: project team members, project manager, and project sponsor. I like to think about a new project by remembering this book. It's called Orbiting the Giant Hairball by Gordon MacKenzie. The blue ball in the middle is the hairball. Like most projects, it can seem overwhelming with all the moving pieces going around the middle. The project manager is actually in the hairball trying to keep it all together. She or he is the only one in the hairball. All the other roles, and note these aren't individuals, these are roles, are in orbit around the hairball. In this case, there will be the sponsor. I often put this at the very top since they're the most important person. And depending on your project, you'll likely have different stakeholders. And in this example, functional leaders, experts, finance, and customers are all involved in this project, and you can see them sort of circling the middle. Take a moment to look at this discussion about the project sponsor. The sponsor's most important job during the project is to ensure that the project objectives are clear and that the cost-benefit analysis makes it a good investment for the company's resources. I like that phrase. The sponsor's most important job during the project is to make sure the project objectives are clear and it's going to make money the way it's supposed to make money. My friend Joan Knutson shared with me this 3-part marching orders for a project sponsor. It's possible that as a project manager, you may have to gently coach the project sponsor on their role. On the next 2 slides, you're going to create a simple and relevant question for you as the project manager to ask of the project sponsor. You may need to pause the recording at that point and think about the questions that you will need to ask of the project sponsor. Briefly go through this page and the next and look at the 3 different question areas for starting, in progress, and ending. Determine what will be useful for your projects. This is during the life of the project, so not the start of the project, but once you have it getting going. And the project sponsor, of course, is reporting that. Please stop the recording and look at these questions and see if any are relevant for your project. To summarize, let's look at what project management is not. It's not just filling out forms all the time and never getting anything done. It's not an excuse to ignore what the whole organization wants. It's not about you. And if there's late or poor quality or budget issues, that's still an issue. And of course, the project manager and the project sponsor and all of the people working on the project are not a substitute for a brain. The last one is one of my favorites. Sometimes project managers and their teams just go through the motions, not really challenging or enhancing the project they are working on. Another problem is adding tool sets to the project. Sometimes the tool sets can take over, and again, the brains then aren't working very well. One of my favorite quotes is this: "A fool with a tool is still a fool, so don't be a fool." As you go through this slide, you're going to see it build. Here are my high-level steps of building a great project. First, it's define. That's going to be the initiation, as we talked about before. Then you're going to build the plan. Then you're going to manage and monitor at the same time, of course. And then finally, you're going to review and close well. Note that each of the 4 has steps below when you do your build. Take a moment to read through the 4 columns and read all the bullet points. Did you also notice that it has a beginning, start, and an end? Remember what that means? It means it's a project, not a process. So let's pause a minute before we go deep into those steps. Stop the video and take a moment to make some notes about what you've learned as we've talked through roles and the work to do, and then we'll get started with the beginning of the project. This is the same diagram we looked at earlier. Notice the dare to properly manage resources on the top corner. That's just a mnemonic for my classes so the students learn define, plan, manage, review. Right now, we're going to focus primarily on define, the first step, because plan, manage, and review are probably processes that you usually do. If you would like more detail, check out any of these books: Project Management for Trainers, 10 Steps to Successful Projects, and Managing Projects. We'll start with the define phase. Pay a lot of attention to the business objectives, because if they're not well thought out, the project will fail. I'm pretty sure this statue is Athena, but we like to call her Arrakis, the Greek goddess of project management. Arrakis stands for, as you can see on the slide, increase revenue, avoid cost, or improve service. When you're establishing the business objectives for a project, you have to decide whether this project, when completed, will either bring in revenue, drive cost from the business, or improve service. You can only pick one, because if you pick more than one, you're actually trying to do 2 or 3 projects at the same time, which will not turn out well. It turns out that we don't have to worry about improved service, and you'll see that I X that out. That's redundant because increased revenue and avoid cost will create improved service, so we can drop that out. Your job now as the project manager figuring out with the project sponsor, is this project primarily going to be about making money or increasing revenue as we call it, or are we trying to drive cost out of the business? Again, you can only pick one. Pause here and think of a real project you are working on. What is the single business objective for that project? Are you increasing revenue or avoiding cost? Remember, you can only pick one. Next, we want to talk about stakeholders. The stakeholders are a person, role, organization, company, or system who either provides something to the project or receives something from the project. Early, I referenced that project teams are made up of stakeholders. This is the busiest and most important role of all. It's how all the projects get done. A stakeholder provides something to the project or receives something from the project, or potentially both. Remember the hairball on that earlier page? Projects are building by providing stuff and receiving stuff until it all comes together as a cohesive whole. The next thing to think about is defining the scope. For each role, what will go into the project and what will be delivered from the project. As the project manager, you need to keep track of the stakeholders and what they are working on. So if you look at this chart, you can see the name of the stakeholder in the first column, what's going in the second column, what's coming out in the third, and then I always have comments because I'll always have some notes I'll want to put in there. Here's an example. You can see in the first row, that's the project sponsor. They're the stakeholder. That's perfect. The project sponsor provides information to the project, often financial or time-driven, as we talked about before. It can also get deliverables from the investment of that information. And as a project manager, you may want to make sure you're keeping really good notes on column 4. Doing this quick view of the scope of the projects helps you and your stakeholders and your sponsor see the same picture and understand the scope of the people involved. One of the things I love to do, usually with Post-its, is I love the scope diagram. I'm sure you think this looks crazy. It really does. But once you understand what's going on, you can use this uncomplicated diagram to help stakeholders, sponsors, and everyone understand what your project is about. When doing this in class, our learners often use Post-its for those red boxes and flip chart paper to draw the arrows. The blue box in the middle is the project. In this case, I'm going to explain that the project is a volunteer day of caring project. Employees sign up to build houses or clean things up. Our company does Habitat for Humanity, which is a wonderful example like this. All arrows go through the blue box only. Look at them and you can see that. All arrows go through the blue box only. No sneaking around the outside. As the project manager, you'll need to figure out what roles people will need for being on this project. And the roles, you can see some on this: catering, charities, corporate communication, employees, etc. Those are all in the red box. The red boxes, again, are stakeholders, groups of people who are helping build the project. Note that there are arrows going into the middle blue box and also coming out. It's sort of like the sun. This is called balance. When you draw this diagram, there has to be at least one arrow in and one arrow out. There is a project sponsor, we're calling this the CEO, on the top right. When I draw these diagrams, I like to put the project sponsor on the very top of the diagram, of course. You can imagine they like that too. So let's look more closely at this sponsor. Pause a moment and try to figure out what's happening with the arrows from the sponsor to the middle. What story would you tell about this? Well, here's the story I would tell. I would read about the sponsor. The sponsor, again, in the top right, the CEO. The sponsor sends the project, the blue box, remember, budget, governance, and the project responds by sending status reports. So you can see the arrows are going back and forth, and there's no two-headed arrows, there's no craziness. Here's another question. Do you see anything else missing on this diagram based on what we've been talking about? There is one sort of bad thing that's not fixed yet. You're probably seeing that charities looks really weird because it doesn't have two arrows, it only has one. You can have two or more, but you can't have one. So you can see that that's missing an arrow going back. That's what we've been talking about. So looking at the charity box now, you can see it's fixed. You can see the arrow with needs. It's going to the middle like all the others are doing, and things are getting back where they're supposed to be. So for charities, we get volunteers, and then we send needs to the project. When you're building your own scope diagram, remember, there's only one arrowhead, no double-headed arrows, and arrows cannot go between those red boxes. Those are stakeholders. You are communicating through the project. If you let everybody talk to each other, it would be chaos. Everything flows from the middle. The rest of the define phase is pretty easy to understand. You're probably familiar with project objectives at some point in your life. So look at the top on the slide and see, so what? What is a project objective? Well, it needs to be concrete and specific, measurable, achievable and realistic, time-bound, and it's about the project deliverables. So project objectives in project management are those specific tangible outcomes that are produced and delivered by the project. They identify and describe what you're going to do at the end, what you'll have that you don't have now. So think about a project objective that you might create for a Day of Caring event like we were talking about. I have an example. My project objective is to clean sidewalks for 3 hours. So if that's my project objective, is it okay if I hold it up against that so what? Is it concrete and specific, measurable, achievable and realistic, time-bound, refers to project deliverables? Yep, that's good. We're going to talk about both risk and constraints because they're different. Risk is something that negatively impacts a business, but it hasn't happened yet. It might happen. So there might be a sponsor change, that's a big one, or it might be a budget cut, something like that. So what do you do with risk? You have to prevent and react to the stakeholders. Now, a constraint is something that we already know has happened, and it's not going anywhere. So a constraint is a challenge that will definitely happen. It could be a fixed budget, a fixed date, limited resources. You have to accept it and work within the limits. A lot of times people fight this. They're like, well, it's a constraint, but we should change it. No, the project sponsor wants it like that. So what is a risk in your project? Think of something you might be able to get enough staff to work on a project and change something. What is a constraint in your project? Maybe people have to leave by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That would be a constraint. So a lot of times people think risk and constraints are the same thing, but they're absolutely not. A risk has not happened. A constraint has. Let's get a little deeper into risk management. And honestly, in my practice, if you do these early on, and we're right at the beginning of the project, right? It's another way to keep your eyes wide open when you see trouble coming your way. Risk drives how much time it will take to finish the project. So here's a little cheat sheet that we use to step back, eyes wide open, evaluate the risk of your current project. The trick, of course, is not being overly optimistic. So you can see on this little chart, there's size, structure, and technology. Size is how big the project is and how long it will take to finish. Let's say for the day of caring we talked about earlier, the risk of this project being successful is 4 out of 10. Now, there's no magic with that. I just made that up. It has to do with whatever your project is. Structure is the stability of the requirements. How stable are they? Are the requirements for the day of caring shared, and is everyone involved? Well, maybe not. So let's call the risk for this one 5 out of 10. And then finally, technology. And technology usually includes wires, processes, but also methodologies and compliance, and even sometimes people. So don't get stuck on the technology word. There's not much technology in cleaning up a sidewalk, so I'll call this risk 2 out of 10. Next, you average all 3 of your numbers to come out with a risk. In this case, the average is about 3.6 out of 10. That's a pretty low number, so it probably indicates that the risk is really not very large. So what you do as you use this for your projects, if it comes out 1 to 3, can be treated somewhat informally, but be careful and keep an eye on it. 4 to 6, spend a little more time on formal project management documentation and communication. 7 to 8, formal disciplined communication and PM. Special care on risk because it's very likely that there's risk going on there. And then 9 to 10, try to break it into more projects, into smaller projects, because it's going to be very difficult to be successful. Here's another way to use this little chart to go deeper into risk. Think of a risk you have in your work at this time. In the day of caring, you can see on this slide, they know there are not enough volunteers and they're not going to get any more. How likely do you think this risk will occur? Well, we'll say medium, probably a little bit, right? What impact will there be if the risk does occur and we don't have enough volunteers? The impact, as you can see on this chart, is high. What can we prevent ahead of time? Well, maybe if we create more communication to get more people involved, that might be a way to prevent some of the problems. Well, what if that doesn't work and we can't prevent it? Well, we're going to have to go find friends, I guess. Take one of your e-learning projects now and use this chart to figure out what your risk is. Here's another look at being prepared. In all projects, there are 3 main triggers that you have to manage, and we've been talking about this. You have to manage time, you have to manage cost and money, and you have to manage quality and scope. And we put those together because if the scope is too big, you won't have the right quality, etc. As a project manager, you have to prioritize these 3, and sometimes it is really hard. You have to order them. What is most important, not as important, and not important at all. Tons of times in classes, people just don't want to do that. They want to have 2 in one box. They're very serious about things like that. But you really have to make a choice. Again, going back to our day of caring, the results could be prioritized like what we have on this table. The day of caring people think that time is most important. There's only one day they can do this. That's the first one. And you can see it's fixed. It's not being changed. That's the most important one. Then cost. Cost is slightly less important. A volunteer day of caring will likely not get a lot of extra money, but you probably might be able to get some. Maybe there would be some donation. So you can see the moves a little, right? In the middle, there's a little bit of flex there. And then quality scope. Everyone wants everything to be perfect, but sometimes you don't have the time or money to get quality, or the project is too big, or the scope is too big. So sometimes all you have left is to cut the whole project down a little bit, do a smaller event and do well. That's the job of a really good project manager. When a project manager, instead of fighting there's too much work to do, knows how to cut out the best things to be put in the best places. Use this chart when you start your project to be able to see the constraints clearly when you start. Then you can use a spreadsheet or just a chart like this for simple status reports. We've worked through the define phase, which is setting up and understanding, of course, for the project we are working on. In the plan phase, now you have to use this spreadsheet similar to plan the project work. Once the plan is set up, you can manage the work. So as you look at this, you have the project, the volunteer day. You have different tasks that need to be done. You figure out who the project manager is. And do you notice something about this picture? Notice the person's name is in every single column on the project manager. Because remember, we said only one project manager, and the task owner could have multiple people working, so there's different names there. These are the due dates. I like to have comments, and I love to check stuff off, so that's what I do in the right-hand column. So a miracle occurs, and it's time to transition to maintenance. The project is done. After the project is reviewed and signed off, you are no longer working on a project because now it's a process. It's probably going to run forever and ever and ever. You've created something of value to your organization, and now you need to maintain it. Creating a process with owners, documentation, training, and support is critical if you want to get the value from the project that you built to get this process done. And you can see on the slide that ending the project, you'd like to have the customer sign off. You'd like to archive the scope diagram, the project schedule. Maybe you can share those later and kind of learn for those when you do your next project. And then you need to establish who's going to be the owner, and where are they putting the training documentation, and who is doing the ongoing support. I would say that in general, very often, none of this gets done. Once the project is done, everybody sort of disappears and they forget to actually fill this very important maintenance piece out. To review what our journey through projects is all about, let's take a moment to see how you feel about what you learned today. We're going to use this emotion-based survey item at the top. First, I'm going to ask you to describe the problems experienced on the project by entering on this line the emotion you felt. What emotion do you feel when you do projects? Then I want you to rank that emotion. How much emotion is it? 1 to 10? Put that in the next little line. Number 2, after you did your project, what factors contributed to your feelings about the problems? What things troubled you that you might want to be able to do better next time? Then number 3, describe the successes experienced on the project by entering on this line the emotion you felt. Rank the intensity of that emotion about being successful. Again, 1 to 10. And then finally, what factors contributed to your overall feelings about the success? So as you go through these, you'll learn more about how your project went, but also how you can make your next project even better. If you use a survey each time you complete your projects, you'll be more mindful of define, plan, manage, and review. Now let's remember again that we wanted to talk about virtual e-communications. Here are the other side of what you should think about as you're working on your projects. Remember, when we're working virtually, sometimes we have trouble keeping people together. We talked about this in the beginning. So here's a little cheat sheet for you on that as well. How is communication lacking? How are team meetings lacking? How is your team overusing technology? How prepared are you for being a leader, not just a provider? Who will you communicate with as you work on your projects? What do they want to know about you and your project? What communication format and frequency is best for your whole team? And it's always important to know how much time must you prioritize ahead of time for communication. not just for the project. I like to use these 2 pages to review the importance of realistic project management, whether online, blended, or face-to-face. Some of this is a little tongue-in-cheek. Regardless of your work, here are the 5 deadly sins of project management. Number 1, seek first to blame. There's no time for blaming in project management, just get moving. Number 2, I'm busy, so I must be making progress. We all know it's very easy to confuse busyness with being productive. There's more danger of busyness when people are not communicating. Number 3, sure, we can do that. Be very honest with yourself, your teams, and leaders, and tell the truth. It is common for all of us to want to help, but overwhelming yourself will not help anybody. Number 4, that will just take a minute. This is similar to the last, but very, very careful not to minimize the amount of work needed for your project. And number 5, all projects are the same. Of course they're not, because people are all different. Here are the 5 heavenly atonements of project management, cleaning up that list that we just went through. On this list, we're going to focus on the positive. Instead of blaming, collaborate intentionally with others. Instead of pretending you're busy, evaluate the return on the work that you and your team do constantly. Don't say things just because people want to hear them. Avoid tough talk about money and cost on your work, and you will get in big trouble later. Leave time to think, plan, and innovate, because it will always take planning and there will always be pivots. And all projects are different and unique. I like this quote from Cornelius Fichtner. The P in project management is as much about people management as it is about project management. Thank you so much for joining me to talk about e-project management. Here are some of my books, and feel free to reach out to me if there's anything you'd like to chat about. Thanks very much to your L&D Adobe team for providing me with this wonderful opportunity. The last 2 slides of this presentation are templates for the project charter template and the project schedule. If you would like to receive a free iterative project charter template, please send a request to Shauna.Mosier@mosierit.com. Thanks again.